Hey there, welcome to the Soil and Roots podcast, journeying together into deep discipleship. I'm Brian Fisher, and this is episode 108, The Kingdom Regardless, with my very special guest, Dr. Darrell Bock. I hope you've been enjoying this season 5. What we're doing is having conversations with professionals and specialists and some amazing thinkers as we explore some of the themes that we covered in season 1 through 4. Now, normally I keep these introductions pretty short, but today I'm going to give you some background, some context, because it's a fairly complicated show. Okay, you might recall that last season, season 4, was all about the forgotten kingdom. So here's the premise. Soil and Roots is all about our journey to become more like Jesus. It's an ongoing, lifelong journey of spiritual formation or character formation. To do that, we should certainly strive to understand Jesus and his mission. What is his primary purpose? Well, as scripture tells us, it's the kingdom of God. We're to seek it first. It's the very first request mentioned in the Lord's Prayer that Jesus taught us to pray. We find parables, teachings, metaphors, allusions to it all over the New Testament. But in modern Christianity, it's rarely taught. Many people have very ambiguous ideas about what the kingdom of God actually is. Some people think the kingdom just means heaven. Others believe it means the church, the body of people worldwide who follow Jesus. Back in season 4, we wrestled with a few definitions and sort of settled on the one from Dr. Jeremy Treat, God's reign through God's people over God's place. In a sense, the kingdom encompasses heaven and the church, but it's far bigger and grander than even that. So Jesus' mission is not only to save sinners to individual salvation, but the cosmic restoration of the universe. The Bible is, after all, a story of Eden to New Eden, creation to new creation. Okay, so we did a mini-series in season 4 on how our views of the end times and Israel impact our view of the kingdom today and thus our spiritual formation. Many folks believe that our views of the end times are peripheral, that it's just a side issue. I disagree, because those views are integrated with and they impact our ideas about Jesus' purpose and thus our purpose. You might recall that we briefly introduced the 4 primary end times views that are popular today: pre-millennialism, dispensationalism, amillennialism, and post-millennialism. There's no such thing as a brief or short theological term. Then we sort of cheated and tried to simplify it further, and we caught on to Dr. Heiser's 2 main groups, joiners and splitters. These are gross generalizations, but splitters normally include premillennialists and dispensationalists. Joiners tend to include amillennialists and postmillennialists. So why did Heiser choose those terms? At least according to him, splitters tend to split ideas and events in the Bible. That's the way they read it. Whereas joiners tend to join ideas and concepts together. That's the way they read it. So, for example, the second coming. Splitters find 2, sometimes 3, physical comings of Christ in our future. Splitters hold to a rapture, the secret rescue of the church prior to the second coming. So the second coming is in sort of effect split. Joiners find only 1 physical return of Christ in the Bible. They don't hold to the idea of a rapture, a secret rescue of the church. Another example is just the people of God. Many splitters believe the Bible points to 2 people and 2 plans. The people or nation of Israel has a specific ongoing plan in our future, as does the church. Joiners see the New Testament as primarily drawing those 2 groups together. Last example is the kingdom. As we'll briefly discuss today, some splitters split the kingdom of God. Jesus is saving souls and communities into eternal life today, but the stewardship of creation, the reformation of culture, those things won't occur during this age. In fact, this age is going to end in disaster. Christ will restore the creation and cultural aspects of his kingdom, but not until the next age, after the rapture, the tribulation, and so on. Joiners don't split the kingdom. They view Christ as redeeming people, creation, and culture right now, though they don't always agree on how all that ties together. One of my primary points from season 4 is that we should really wrestle with our end times views and how they impact our spiritual formation, our discipleship, and we should wrestle with it far more than we typically do. Believing that Jesus is just saving souls, that's one thing. Believing that he will save all of creation and culture one day down the road, that's another. Believing that he and the church should focus on the cosmic restoration of all things, people, community, culture, creation, right now, is yet another. They're three fairly different ideas. And all three ideas deeply impact the way we live our daily lives and thus our spiritual formation. Okay, so into all of that context steps our guest today, Dr. Darrell Bock. He's the senior research professor of New Testament studies at Dallas Theological Seminary, and he's also the executive director of cultural engagement there. I first met Dr. Bock, it could be 10 years ago now, because he invited me down to DTS a few times to be a guest on his show. He has a podcast called The Table Podcast, which focuses on cultural engagement. And he was very kind to accept my offer to join me on our podcast, Soil and Roots. He keeps a crazy schedule, writes books and articles, lectures around the world, and as he jokes on the show today, he has a lot of frequent flyer miles. What makes our dialogue so interesting is that Dr. Bock is what's called a progressive dispensationalist. He doesn't quite fit into the four categories I just shared with you, nor does he quite fit into a splitter or joiner group. He holds to the rapture and the tribulation and a literal millennium, though he believes the Bible teaches more in common between splitters and joiners than what we might expect. Unity among Christians and the kingdom are big highlights for him. You're going to hear some terms we don't normally use here. We talk about dispensationalism a lot, and you'll also hear non-dispensational and the term covenant theology. Those second two groups are generally considered joiners. Though we do explore how our end times views impact our understanding of the kingdom, you're going to pick up on what I think is some of the heart and soul of Dr. Bock's mission and work. What does it mean to live in the kingdom today? How are we representing Christ and his kingdom in our words, in our behaviors, and in how we relate to those with whom we might disagree? We're going to talk about the dispensational view of future events and Israel, though you're going to notice Dr. Bock keeps returning to the vital importance of our character, our relationships, our approach to others. Plus, he has some amazing one-liners that I hope you pick up on. And don't worry, if you're more of the joiner perspective, I'm working on having someone on the show who represents that view as well. But I think all of us will find Dr. Bock to be engaging, very fair, unifying, and gracious. And I think that's exactly what he hopes for the future of the church. So sit back and enjoy my fascinating conversation with Dr. Darrell Bock. All right, thanks again for joining us. I am thrilled and pleased to be joined by Dr. Darrell Bock from Dallas Theological Seminary, as I just talked about in the introduction, and we're going to go into the kingdom and some pretty technical pieces related to it in terms of how different folks around the world view it. So, Dr. Bock, thanks so much for taking the time to join us today from Dallas.
It's my pleasure, and it's good to be with you, Brian.
You are pretty well known for helping to develop and teach what's known as progressive dispensationalism. Now, for a lot of our audience, I've just used a term that most of us aren't familiar with, but months ago, we kind of stepped through the four kind of big views of the end times, or that's probably a limited way of saying it, but eschatological views, hermeneutic views, and dispensationalism was one of those. Most people probably haven't heard of progressive dispensationalism. Can you kind of walk us through, compare and contrast, if you will, dispensationalism with progressive dispensationalism?
Well, the major feature of dispensationalism is that it insists on keeping Israel in the program of God, and argues that a dispensation is a stewardship. It's the way God's managing salvation. So he's doing it through the nation of Israel, basically in the Old Testament. He does it today through the church, which is Christ's body. He's present, but not visibly present, and that is a transnational community made up of Jews and Gentiles. And then in the future, there's going to be a millennium when Jesus shows up physically ruling over the kingdom. So it's a millennial view, not an amillennial view. We don't just go directly new heaven and new earth. And that also will be transnational and will be a place of intensified righteousness and intensified justice, and is a stage into the new heavens and the new earth. And so those three stages, Israel, church, and kingdom, are distinct administrative managements of the program of God. That's what a dispensation is. And then the idea of progressive is simply the idea that as you move from one dispensation to the other, there is both continuity and discontinuity in how those administrations work. And what distinguishes progressive dispensationalism from traditional dispensationalism, which has had a variety of forms, is the emphasis on the continuity of promise. We have taken the covenants of the Old Testament, the Abrahamic covenant that promised a land, a people, and blessing on the world through a seed, and the Davidic covenant, which promised a Davidic ruler, and then the new covenant, which promised the forgiveness of sins and writing the law in the heart, or to use the picture of Ezekiel, a washing that allows God to put his spirit inside of us because our vessels have been cleansed, that those promises have been inaugurated in the first coming with Jesus, in that the forgiveness of sins and the offer of the Spirit is taking place, but the establishment of righteousness and the judgment related to judgment is yet to come. And so in more traditional dispensationalism, all the emphasis was on the future realization of what was going on. And the way in which the current era of the church connected to those promises was kind of, I'll use an image, leapt over. Actually, it was presented as a parenthesis in the plan of God with reference to Israel. And in one sense, it is a parenthesis in reference to Israel, but it's not a parenthesis in the kingdom plan of God. God always was expecting his Messiah to show up. He would be rejected by his own, and yet God would still exalt him. And so it has to do with the amount we see more continuity as a progressive dispensationalist in the program of God than more traditional dispensationalists, which tended to emphasize strictly the discontinuities.
So just so I can boil that down, does that mean that the church age prior to dispensationalism's view of end times events, the rapture, the tribulation, that the Israel and the church are woven closer together? Because dispensationalism is sort of known for the two people, two plan. There's a plan for Israel, there's a plan for the church.
That's the very oldest form of dispensationalism. Yes, the two people, two plan, particularly the people, the heavenly people, which are the church, and the earthly people, which is Israel. That there was even a spatial element in the original dispensationalism.
Okay.
That got watered down in the intervening period, the kind of dispensation that kind of predates progressive. And there was a recognition that there was a oneness on the one hand, and it wasn't so much spatial as it was structural, if I can say it that way, that the way the church was structured and the way the millennium was structured would be different. And Israel has a central place in the kingdom to come that it doesn't have currently. That was what got emphasized by the what we call revised dispensationalism, because it revises the original, which was more spatial.
Okay.
We come along and say, yes, there's a oneness to the people of God, but we still have to keep Israel and the church distinct. And the way in which covenant promises are initially realized applies to the church and not just to a kingdom Israel in the future, even though it will apply to a kingdom Israel, a kingdom that Israel is very much involved in the future. And so it just has to do with a kind of reshuffling of the emphasis and the connections.
Okay. Well, so let me go back to a question that I've had. When we talk about Israel, modern day Israel, what do we mean? Is that by blood? Is that where they live? Like, what does that, when you say Israel, what do you mean?
Well, Israel is being used in Scripture in a variety of ways. It refers to a people on the one hand. It can refer to a people who are responsive to God. On the other, it can refer to a people who are supposed to be responsive to God but are rebellious on the other. And then for some people, Israel becomes a term for people of God and not so much a national term when we get to the New Testament and Gentiles included. Dispensationalists have generally tended not to use the term that way. And perhaps the passage where you see the difference most vividly is in Romans 9 to 11.
Yeah.
In Romans 9 to 11, there is a discussion in the middle of the passage about God making people who are not his people into his people. But Israel, at least as Paul is focused on them, is pretty much limited to the nation, the people, the bulk of whom have not responded to the Messiah, so Paul says, I wish I were accursed for the sake of my people. And he has them very much in view all the way to the end when he contemplates natural branches being grafted back into the vine so that they have a part in the salvation that comes through Christ eventually. And so we have, as dispensationalists, this is true of all dispensationalists, have always distinguished that unbelieving element of Israel from the people of God. The people of God are one. Believing Jews are a part of that. Messianics are a part of that, etc. But that's not Israel. Now, you asked me about modern day Israel. Modern day Israel is a people who are in that line, how can I say, racially and religiously, if I can kind of say it that way. But because they don't believe in Christ, they're in disobedience. And this is Jesus' remark in Luke 13 and also the end of Matthew 23. Your house is desolate until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. And so Israel has a place in God's program, but when she's in the midst of disobedience, she needs to opt in order to experience the blessing that comes with the covenant promises, which were made to her, in which God faithfully says one day she will fulfill, but she's not currently fulfilling them.
Okay, so if the word Israel or the idea of Israel is interpreted in a lot of different ways, and the older I get, the more I realize there's lots of things in Scripture that work like that. It's not nearly as simple as we'd like.
Yeah, this is why we have our conversations.
That's right. That's why we wrestle with it.
Yeah.
If in my again limited understanding, traditional dispensationalism actually viewed a different plan of salvation for the nation of Israel.
That's in the most original. I would say that's in the most original form of dispensationalism, not the intermediate stage that I was talking about. That is probably what most people are familiar with when they hear about dispensationalism, and certainly not with progressives. So there never were two plans of salvation. There were two groups of people with whom salvation was concerned. Okay. But that was a singular plan.
Right. Okay. And so progressive dispensationalism, if I'm hearing it correctly, says the nation, the ethnic group, if they've not yet come to Christ, there is a plan for them in the future in which they do.
Right. And thus there is a concern for the church to be sure that we continue to engage in witness to Jewish people in the process, so that when Romans says, I'm not ashamed of the gospel, it's the power of God and salvation to the Jew first and to the Greek, we don't drop Israel out of that equation.
That's right. But I'm assuming that's not to the exclusion of other unreached people
groups. Not at all. In fact,
no.
I make the point when I talk about this, and even talk about the eschatology and the return of Israel into blessing, that this is not a nationalism, okay? It's a part of the reconciliation program that God has ongoing with salvation. When we isolate Israel at the expense of the nations, we've actually missed the point of the exercise, which is to bring God's in the business of taking estranged people, Jews and Gentiles, and bringing together under his blessing. Okay, that's what he was doing in the first century. That's his goal eventually. That's eventually what he's going to do in such a way that shalom comes to the earth. I tell people the reconciliation of the Bible is an anti-tribal message in a tribal world. And so if you think about it that way, you realize God is taking estranged people. He's making them family. They're supposed to get along and work alongside one another. So my line is, God has adopted us, whether we're Jew or Gentile. The question is, have we adopted one another? And in thinking through, how do you get to shalom? How do you get to peace? Well, you get people who are reconciled, who were formerly estranged from one another, and you get them working together and collaborating together and serving God in front of God together well.
So there seems to be, in sort of more traditional or maybe revised dispensational camps, there's a focus very much on Israel as a nation state, on political events, watching the Middle East, oftentimes because they'll relate that to fulfillment of prophecy. Non-dispensationalists again, from my limited perspective, say, well, of course they're a friend of the U.S. They're like-minded people, but we don't quite understand the attention that they get related to other nations. Of course, they don't necessarily have the same view of the end times, but
it's a good distinction that you're making. What tends to happen is, and this will even be particularly with post-tribulational people who are post-tribulational and not dispensational, but are millennial. Okay,
yeah, right,
all code words. Okay,
yes, all very confusing.
yeah, and they'll say, yes, this is true of individual Jews and the Jewish people. Okay, but we're not so interested in Israel as a nation, as a political entity. But to me, that ignores the fact that when we come to the millennium and Christ is ruling over not just people, but the nations, okay, that nations have not dropped out of this equation. Or to say it another way, Isaiah 19:23-25, which sees Assyria, Egypt, and Israel all blessed, each bearing a name of God in the eschaton. Those are national entities that we're talking about. So it isn't just a racial designation, if I can say it that way. And so to have that drop out of the equation is problematic.
And you've seen that evidenced in the media and in kind of the
Sure.
evangelical
Yeah,
approach
I see
to
it. I see the confusion all the time that there. And again, another reflection of this is when we think about our own salvation, we tend to think about it very much in individual terms.
That's right.
But we don't tend to think about it so much in corporate terms. And so there's both a corporate and an individual dimension to this salvation. And the beauty of this, at least the way we're trying to articulate it, is you get a oneness through the reconciliation, but you do not get a dissolution of who God made you to be in terms of your nationality. And so part of the beauty of seeing the reconciliation is God has brought together formerly estranged people, not just people, but nations that were at each other's throat, if I can say it that way. And he's bringing peace between them. And you see the grace of God running through all the structures of life.
I was reading Randy Alcorn's book on heaven. I don't know if you've checked that out, but he talks about his view is that even ancient nations will somehow be preserved and honored in new creation. And, Rome, Greece, it's an interesting kind of perspective. It's
Well,
a little bit
again,
mind-blowing.
it's an affirmation of the peoples with whom God has been engaged from the beginning of time.
Yeah. Well, and contrary to that, I just finished a book on disciple making, which insisted that Jesus is no longer Jewish. I thought, my gosh, like if you strip him of his Jewishness, you've just removed.
Well, hard to do in the New Testament. I mean, he got circumcised on the 8th day. I'm sorry.
That's right. Pretty sure he's Jewish.
Yeah.
Well, let's move to the hermeneutic, because this has been an area where I've been just not clear. So dispensationalism, and again, just correct me if these things don't apply to progressive, but one of the key distinctions is what they call the historic literal interpretation of the Bible, including Old Testament prophecies, land promises, whatnot. It seems like, again, as a non-scholar, as I've tried to sort through all this, there's a huge disagreement on what the word literal means. So can you help me understand, what does it mean to a dispensationalist? What does it mean to perhaps like a covenant theologian, which tends to be on the opposite side of the fence? What does it mean to a progressive dispensationalist? Are they different, or how does that work through?
Yeah, I mean, how literal is literal before you're not literal? I mean,
Right.
And I just prefer the term normal. I read these texts normally in light of their literary genre, et cetera, and I take the commitment that God makes to certain promises to certain audiences to be to them. And even if the promise gets expanded to include someone else, I don't lose the original recipient. Or to put it another way, when we're in apocalyptic literature, we got all these strange images. Okay, I recognize those are symbolic. Okay, they're intended to be read symbolically. They're not intended to be taken literally. So when I get these beings that are kind of mixed of animal traits and that kind of thing, I'm not supposed to think about some of the science fiction movies that we see and say, oh, that's really going to happen and it's going to happen that way. No, it's the traits of the animals that are mixed together are representative of certain kinds of traits that nations have. And I'm not supposed to take that quite so literally. It's imagery that's designed to convey something else. And I understand that because it's part of a genre that does that kind of thing. The dispute that you generally have between dispensationalists and non-dispensationalists is really less about that as it is about a shift that is undertaken between the original recipients of Old Testament promises, which were clearly focused on Israel and primarily Jewish people, to the way in which that's been broadened to include Gentiles and often exclude Israel because of recurrent disobedience, usually. And therefore, the original recipients have now become transformed into a broader group, largely Gentile, almost devoid of any Jewish presence, etc. The dispensationalists are saying, no, God made commitments to Jewish people back then that he will eventually keep to them, even as he's blessing us, in the church, those of us who are Gentile. And so I can add on, if you will, but I never lose the group to whom the original commitment was made. That's the point. And when Israel gets turned into a broad term, not ethnic, just to refer to someone who believes in the promises of God, and it gets, how can I say this, denationalized in the process or transformed into a spiritual Israel on the other, that's when we complain.
So how does that relate to like the land promises? Because this seems to be where there's a lot of disagreement. Dispensationalists will say the land promises in Israel were not fulfilled in the Old Testament fully. They're going to be fulfilled sometime in the future. A non-dispensational would say either, well, A, they were fulfilled, and then Israel sort of divorced themselves from God, or the news is even better. If a Jew comes to Christ, they get the whole world. It's better than just the Canaanite land. So how does that get worked out?
One of the problems we have with eschatology is people force us to make choices we don't have to make.
Okay.
So on the one hand, the blessing that extends to the entire world. On the other hand, Israel has a place in that world and will have a home in that world. Okay. So I tell people, my analogy is the European Union. Okay. A person can be a European and a German at the same time. Okay. The union extends across all those nations. The Germanic nature extends to the people who are in Germany. And both are true. And so I can have a blessing with Christ ruling over all the world that inherits all the spiritual benefits that come with him on the one hand, but Israel lives in shalom in the midst of the nations as God promised in the Old Testament. Those both can happen. And then I tease people, I say, I'll let the British sort out how they tie it into the analogy and whether they want to be a part of it or not. But that's the picture. Okay. You have a universal rule of God, which is extended to all the creation, which Gentiles, this is why the hope of the future is not an Israeli nationalism. Okay. Because the blessing extends the entire world. But the flip side is Israel has a home. I'll be real cynical now. Israel will not have to deal with Hamas in the future. Okay. She will have a home, be at peace, and no one will be trying to kick her out of her land.
Got it. Okay. It seems like I've read what little I've read about you and progressive dispensationalism. You seem to take shots from everybody. I mean,
that's because we're critiquing everybody. I mean, in one sense, we're critiquing some of the traditional dispensational views that tend to go in a more nationalistic direction, or that I say undersell what's going on now in the kingdom. And then we take shots from the covenant people because we haven't totally come over to them, because we're still insisting, no, Israel is a part of this story.
Right.
You can't lose her in the story. She's actually a pretty important part of the picture of reconciliation that the whole shooting match is about. And so we're I used to use this analogy, that there were two islands. Okay. One was a dispensational island. The other was a covenant island, and they were shooting each other. And we came in our little boat between the two and said, well, here's what we think is going on. And we're not totally connected to either of you in one sense, at different ways. And so as they're shooting each other, they go, oh, there's that little boat coming between. We'll get them too.
Ironically, it seems like you're attempting to build bridges, but you're getting shot at while you're building the bridges.
Well, that's because people love their tribes, and so there's an identity and a history tied to it. And so that's what's going on. And of course, what we're trying to say is there's a way to put all these pieces together. And what we're saying to both sides each of you has something of merit that you're contending for in relationship to the Bible, but there also are some things that aren't quite properly aligned biblically either. And we're an equal opportunity employer. We will point out both the benefits and the limitations of what you are suggesting.
You're obviously comfortable with being disliked, which I love. It's fantastic.
Well, this is a bad comparison, but Jesus was comfortable with being
That's right. That's right. Well, give us some examples. Well, you've given one or two already, but in terms of how, and again, when I say building bridges, it's not because you're just trying to make stuff up. You're saying, look, these two sides, which have traditionally really been at odds, biblically speaking, there's more commonality than what you each might assume.
And remember what I said before, which is that eschatology tends to fall into a trap in which we're asked to make distinctions or make choices that we don't have to make.
Okay.
That if we do a better job of defining the scope of different elements of what's going on, there actually is a way to put the whole together so that they're not in conflict, but they actually complement one another. That's actually what we're contending for.
Okay.
And interestingly, the progressive covenantalists are doing the same thing from the other side. Okay, they're doing some of the same thing. They still have the Israel problem, and so that's where that conversation lies. I mean, those two groups are much closer together. And one of the things that's happened in the last 50 years, I'll say it this way, one of the things that's happened in the last 50 years is the tone of the conversation between the two groups is completely different than what it was 50 years ago. 50 years ago, they were shooting at each other. I mean, it was bazooka game, and everyone was shooting with big weapons, etc. And really, almost to the point of if a person was held the other eschatological view, you wondered if they belonged in the church. I mean, so there was some of that going on.
That's right.
That's not the conversation that's happening now. There's a recognition of things that are worth discussing with one another, and an appreciation from each side about the attempt to try and make sense out of what is, a complex set of ideas tied to the Bible. And so the tone of the conversation is very different now than it was 50 years ago. Now, you have some people who are trying to fight the old battles with the old tone. Okay. But that's not healthy for the church.
No. Well, that's good to hear. I mean, as an outsider who's not directly engaged in the debate, I'm just glad to hear the tone has softened. Well, let's talk about an example. So if progressive dispensationalism and progressive covenantalism are closer than the traditional two sides, what would the dispensationalist need to hear or see from the covenantalist in relation to Israel to say, okay, we're pretty well aligned now?
Don't just think of Israel racially. Think of Israel nationally. We've already talked about it.
Right.
That there is both a corporate, there's the individual dimension that's racial and talks about what my personal background is, what, where I came from, if I can say it that way. But there also is a corporate national entity about what God's going to do over the nations in the millennium when he's ruling over all the nations in the midst of a world. There's a geography and a political nature to that's going to continue to exist. That's a part of the story. Don't lose that. And if you only put it in soteriological terms and only put it in racial individual terms, you're missing part of what's going on. We're all agreed that everything that happens that benefits people comes through Christ and is a function of grace. We're all agreed on that. But what those structures look like underneath is what gets discussed.
Is there room to unify that when you're dealing with like an all-millennialist who says, well, we're in the millennium right now, or is there no conversation there?
That's harder to do, because anyone who thinks we're in the millennium right now has got to deal with the reality that sin is a big part of the picture that's not a part of the millennium, at least not ultimately. Or even if you go to the new heavens and the new earth and you say there isn't a kingdom part, one of the dangers of actually skipping the kingdom part and going to the new heaven and the earth is you lose that national structure and the resolution of this history in these structures. At least you risk doing that. What's happened in amillennialism is interesting. They used to talk about it in spiritual terms, et cetera, and didn't think about the structures underneath. Now there's some forms of amillennialism that say, well, yes, there's going to be national structures, et cetera. And then it becomes a difference between, does the consummation have two steps in it, or do we immediately, go to Park Place, don't pass Don't go to jail. Don't pay your $200. You're immediately on Park Place. And that difference also is smaller than the discussion used to be, because they've now injected a earthly reality into the picture of what the amillennial new heavens and new earth is going to be that didn't exist in amillennialism previously. So these discussions are rubbing off of each other in the various groups in ways that are probably, I think, in the end can be categorized as helpful. But we still have some of those differences.
Sure, and it seems like it's going to take an unfortunately long time, even for those unifications to sort of
it'll be
drip
till
down to the
Christ
rest of
comes
us.
back, and then we'll discover who's right. My joke about Jesus' return is that when Jesus comes back and rules over the millennium or takes us to the new heaven and the earth, we won't be debating who the Pope is.
Well, I think it was Michael Heiser who said, "Hey, look, nobody figured out when Jesus was going to come the first time. We're not going to figure out when he comes the second time."
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and I can fully expect there may be some surprises the second time too.
Yeah, I imagine. All right, well, let's move on to sort of end time stuff specific. Traditional dispensationalism, and again, correct me if I'm using the terms wrong. Rapture, 7-year tribulation, Armageddon's in there, millennium, new creation. Although I don't think traditional dispensationalism had any real emphasis on the kingdom or on the new heaven and new earth. That seems to be very much a feature of progressive dispensationalism. But still, there's this sense that the world is winding down and it's going to get so bad that Jesus has to rescue the church in the rapture. Is that a feature of progressive dispensationalism? And if so, how does that get wedded or unified with a covenantal theologian who's going to say, well, we're not really sure there's a rapture, we're not really sure the tribulation is in the future? Is there a good discussion going on between those points?
Less so, because progressive dispensationalism really aligns with the more traditional view of the future and the events that are associated with it. There's a rapture, usually a pre-tribulation rapture, 7-year tribulation, followed by 1,000-year millennium, and then the new heavens and the new earth. Very little of that has changed significantly for progressive dispensationalists. Now, what has changed is thinking about that. In other words, the reason the world falls apart at the end is because the problem of sin still exists in the world until Jesus comes back and fixes it. And it just gets really bad.
Right.
But the side story on that is, but it's not the Christian's role to promote that degeneration. Okay? That we're actually supposed to be in contrast to that and working towards and for other things. But people are going to reject God's way, and they will reject it in a catastrophic way eventually. That's what a dispensationalist will believe. We're definitely not post-millennial. Right. That we're getting better and better, and one day it's all going to get purged through our efforts. We're definitely not that. I guess we take depravity and its ability to hang around pretty seriously. And so there's that element of the equation that makes for the difference between the groups.
What I've been concerned about, I shared with you before we got on, I had a friend who is dispensational. He said he's a short-term pessimist, long-term optimist, which seems to be what most dispensationalists reflect. The world's going to fall apart because of all the things that you've mentioned. That seems to breed a sort of fatalism, which can cause us to withdraw from stewarding creation or influencing culture, not just because we're sinners, but because we're like, well, this is really just a rescue operation, because in terms of culture, things aren't going to get better until these cataclysmic series of events, and then Christ comes back in the millennium. But it seems like you've reconciled that because you're the executive director for cultural engagement for DTS.
That's a very good observation. I tell people that if their portrayal and characterization of dispensationalism is true, I shouldn't have my job.
That's right.
Okay.
So how do you reconcile that?
Yeah, well, I reconcile it because it is the role of the church to witness to the ways of God in the world. And that's actually part of our mission. My complaint about the church and where it is in relationship to pluralism is that that we have missed opportunities to witness to the distinctiveness of what the gospel produces by not being the church that we ought to be in the midst of the world and pursuing the things that God wants us to pursue about how people should be related to one another. And so we've stepped out of being sensitive on issues of race, or we've stepped out on being sensitive to issues of justice. And we've done that out of a set of concerns where we tend to think that automatically these conversations are about political ideology. Well, no, they're actually about human relations. And they're actually about human relations, about how people made in the image of God should be treating one another. And the church should be witnessing to that in a certain way. And so we miss an opportunity to witness powerfully to how the church makes a difference by stepping out of these conversations. Now, I think there's a reason why that's happened in our history that's produced that mindset across the board. This is not about just dispensationalists. Mm-hmm. And so we've lost that ability to testify to the fact that if reconciliation is being anti-tribal in a tribal world, then the most powerful witness the church has is the ability to show that people of various backgrounds can be made one in Christ and get along. Mm-hmm. I mean, think about how that's a contrast to everything else going on in the world right now. And so we've lost an important way to testify to that. We've lost the ability to go out into the world and care for people outside the church as a statement that says, God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son, to which I like to shorten, God so loved the world that he gave. And so there's a tone and an approach to this that's very, very important and has a deep ethical core that's driving it in relationship to mission, okay, not in relationship to political ideology. Mm-hmm. And recovers the sense of mission, which I think the church is struggling with in a pluralistic world because we're too busy trying to be in a survival mode.
I find your perspective so fascinating and frankly refreshing on this. I had a conversation, this is 15 years ago, with a dispensational professor. And I said, it seems like from what you're teaching and promoting that you expect the world to fall apart. And in fact, if you engage to try to improve the world, you are lengthening the time until Christ comes back. So you're sort of incentivized to let evil persist so that Christ comes back. I said, how do you reconcile that with a command to love your neighbor? I mean, if you see systems and governments and marketplace practices that are abusive and harmful to people in general, and you're not stepping in to try to redeem those things with Christ, it seems at odds. And he said, you're right. And I said, well, what do you do with the tension? He said, that's part of the tension of being a dispensationalist. You're coming along and saying that's not a tension.
The tension of being a dispensationalist, the tension of being a believer is to represent God's presence well in the world.
Regardless of the outcome.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Our goal is to show the way to peace. Our goal is to show the way to reconciliation. Our way is to show the way to God. Okay, and Christianity was originally called the way. It's not an accident.
Right.
And so you show the way, and the way is different than the world. And the church exists in the world in such a way that difference is supposed to be transparent, not only by what's going on inside the church, but how the church relates to people outside the church. And because the great commandment is to love God with all your heart, mind, and soul, and love your neighbor as yourself. And that neighbor has no limitation. So we're trying to say, in fact, my argument is if you make too much of politics, if you make too much of political ideology, you're actually subtly removing the need for the church. And that is not where Christianity ought to be.
That's dangerous.
So, and I think we're wrestling with that to some degree in our country now. And the church has lost its way in being a witness to people outside. We've turned people outside the church into the enemy. They're not the enemy. They're actually the goal. God, Jesus said, Jesus didn't say go into the church and make disciples. He said go into the world and make disciples. And the world that he's talking about is the very fallen, often destructive world that we have to cope with on a daily basis. So we lose mission if we don't have a full-orbed understanding of the way this is supposed to work. And if you're listening to me carefully, everything that I'm talking about is driven by mission.
Yeah. And is that mission the inbreaking of the kingdom?
Yeah, the inbreaking of the kingdom why the gospel is the gospel, why the gospel is necessary for the world, why the church is supposed to witness to the gospel, not just in terms of the declaration of getting people in, but how it lives. All that is a part of the mission of the church. And then the challenge is, this is the way I describe the challenge, because this is where we are, because we have so many people who are not religiously affiliated at all. I mean,
Right.
They don't have a theological bone in their body. They get classified as religious nuns, N-O-N-E-S, not N-U-N-S.
Right.
Okay. I have no religious affiliation whatsoever. And so how do you bring people who don't have a theological bone in their body to appreciate a message that's theological through and through? That's our challenge. And the only way you do it, I think, at its core, is getting close enough relationally that you're put in the position to help them create categories they currently don't have. And so that's the challenge of the mission of the church. And unfortunately, we've become so focused on our own survival that we have lost our sense of mission and outreach. We've turned people into the enemy and not the goal. And we miss this point, that this is a spiritual battle in which there are spiritual forces at work that people outside the church, in most cases, don't recognize. And at least in the West. Now, in the other parts of the world, they certainly recognize them and they're afraid of them. But in the West, they don't recognize them. So it's a little bit like someone being kidnapped by someone, only when you rescue someone who's kidnapped, they want to be released because they know they're in trouble. Okay. Today, we go out and try and share our message, and they're trapped spiritually, if I can say it that way, but they don't really even realize they're in danger. And they don't even know that they're trapped. Well, that's a harder rescue mission, and yet that's where we are.
So I think you're talking about paradigm shifting, right? I mean, you're saying
Correct.
The church is responsible not for changing the gospel, but for understanding the idea sets in which we live and confronting them where they are.
We are responsible for not only preaching and teaching the gospel, but for representing the gospel by the way we interact with people. And I'm saying we have a lot of effort to try and preach and teach the gospel, and even to make the gospel central in how we do that. But our representation of the gospel in the midst of doing that could use some help.
So as the executive director of cultural engagement, I'm just curious. Part of my critique of at least the Western church has been, frankly, a lack of cultural engagement, whether somebody's covenantal or dispensational. It doesn't seem to matter,
Right.
Even though I think dispensationalism has a bit of a harder road because it doesn't end well, whereas, a covenantal has whether they're all mill or post mill, it doesn't necessarily end in a cataclysmic series of events. Either way, it seems like we've sort of reduced the gospel. Well, you said it at the top of the show, as only the individual plan of salvation.
That's right.
Versus the restoration of the world.
We are so individually pietistically focused that we have missed vast dimensions of what the gospel is designed to achieve cosmically. When you come to Romans 8, that is a cosmic salvation that we're talking about. That is the entire creation that is being redeemed. And that's what you're trying to talk about and present and emphasize.
But that's not even the focus of most Christians.
That's the problem.
Yeah.
Most Christians are trying to survive the chaos that they feel is going on around them. We have yet to cope in the West. We have yet to cope with the fact that we went from being the home team to not just being the visiting team, but the visiting team who are the rivals who get booed. Okay? That's what's happened in my lifetime. Mm-hmm. And we have yet to cope with that. We have yet to cope with the idea that socially speaking, when you come to the table that says the United States of America, your religion means nothing, by which I mean whether you're a Buddhist, an atheist, an agnostic, a Unitarian, a Protestant, a Catholic, much less your denominations, we all have the same rights. We all have the same rights to be at that table and discuss what our society is supposed to be like. How do you cope with that difference? That's what we have struggled with.
Is part of the animosity towards the Western church our lack of interest or engagement in attempting to bring goodness and wholeness outside of our plan of salvation? Is that part of the derision?
I think the derision of the Western church from the rest of the world has to do with the way in which we presented ourselves as in a privileged position.
Okay.
And in such a way that we offended the sensitivities and the cultures of other cultures around us, and the way we treated them. I think that's part of why you get the reaction to the Western church that you do. But if I think about it internally, what in part caused that was two things. We lacked this corporate vision that is a part of the story. We're so individualistically focused. And then we also allowed the fundamentalist modernist controversy to distort Christianity. And this is both sides. Okay. Christianity was a holistic religion up until the fundamentalist modernist controversy. And there were simple ways to see it. You had state churches. That's pretty holistic. You had the abolition movement. That's pretty holistic. Okay, liberals came along and they said, we like the ethics of Christianity, but we don't buy the theological story underneath it. They pulled it apart. Okay. Right. And they did it by doubting the Bible and the way the Bible works. They were selective in how they got to that ethic, etc. Conservatives looked at that and went, oh man, we don't like that. But we like the division. We're going to emphasize the theological story, and anything that's in social space becomes questionable. Okay. That's social gospel. That's something else. Because that attacked the Bible, we're going to defend the Bible. And so the rift became real and fairly solid. Hopefully it's not permanent, but that's what happened. So when you go to put that back together in a biblical kind of way, both sides are suspicious, okay, because they've drawn the lines on how this works. And so people who try and put that back together and say, no, there's a way to be biblical without being political ideologically based and do this, okay, that gets viewed with suspicion from many in the church because that's into public space. Or if you're going to go into public space, you can only go into public space in a confronting kind of way, okay, in which you're going to complain about the culture and where the culture is. And that's going to be your emphasis. And I think what we're trying to say is, no, there's a way to represent Christ. There's a way to care for people. There's a way to serve the city like Israel was called to do in Babylon, which wasn't the most progressive society that was ever created. And serve in the midst of that environment and show that God cares by the way you treat people and the way you're concerned about the things that are problematic in the world. And to do that as a witness for the core gospel, which you still very much believe in and think is the answer.
So this tends to break down between conservative and liberal lines, right? Your quote-unquote liberal Christians are socially engaged. Whether or not they're taking healthy or unhealthy positions could be debated. Whereas your conservative Christians are usually pretty heady, theological, individual salvation, got to stand by the church.
So I'm in that little tugboat.
Right in the middle.
Just went by the two islands of kind of covenantalism and dispensational, and I kept going. And there were two more islands, left and right. Okay. All right. Yep. And I survived the first visit, and now I've got the second wave that I'm dealing with. Okay. Because the way Christianity should function in the world is to be critical of human constructions that are flawed. Okay. Which means we also have to be self-critical.
Sure.
But that means I don't analyze something because it's dispensational or covenantal. I don't analyze something because it's left or right. I analyze something by asking the question, is it right or wrong?
Right.
Is it true or false?
Right.
Okay. And then I try and make the case for it.
So how does this practically bear out in your role in the cultural engagement piece? Like, how does that manifest itself? Just give one example of how you're building bridges. It manifests
itself in frequent flyer miles. Okay.
Where are you going?
I run around the world, literally. I run around the world talking about this and trying to help the church see it. We produce materials that are designed to reflect this. We are very focused on our ethos and tone about how we engage, because we think the tonal engagement of the church with the world is seriously flawed from a biblical point of view. There's a way to make the critique without being nasty. There's a way to make the critique that communicates a love for people, okay, not a hostility towards them, that kind of thing. So we emphasize on the one hand the content of what we think the Bible calls us to be and who we're supposed to be. But we also emphasize the tone with which we do this, because if I can say the right thing in the wrong way, I'm still wrong.
So it's more, well, I don't want to say more, but it's a heavy emphasis on how are we loving and relating to people we disagree
Correct.
with.
Correct. Okay. And it's also an attempt to sometimes understand that the critique that comes about the way people live from people who are not Christianly oriented may actually have their finger on some of the dynamics that we have to deal with. The problem will not be their analysis. The problem will be the solution they bring to the analysis. And I have to be prepared to say, you know what? I see the problem. I actually agree with you. That's the problem, and those are the dynamics. But the way you're going to solve it is going to be just as tribal as what it is you're fighting against. And it's not going to help us.
So I don't want to put you on the spot, but do you have one story or example of how this sort of played out in some of your conversations? If not, that's fine.
Well, whenever I go speak, I have a talk. I have a weekend series of talks that I give. One of which is 6 texts on cultural engagement, because we don't have a theology of cultural engagement. We need one. And so I go through 6 texts that emphasizes these tones. Almost every passage has this tonal piece in it in the midst of the confrontation. And second talk is how to have difficult conversations. But in the midst of that, when I walk up, people walk up to me and they will say, you've given me an alternative way to think about this rather than viewing it as a culture war. Yeah, I appreciate that, because I've never been entirely comfortable, but I didn't know what the alternative was. You've given me an alternative. That's the way people who get what I'm saying tend to respond to what it is that I'm saying.
So you're introducing a new paradigm without the normal requisite conflict.
Exactly. I'm actually trying to say, how can we introduce a paradigm that leads to conversation and an attempt at mutual understanding, as opposed to starting off in a highly confrontive mode in which everybody gets defensive.
Right. It's called the 1% principle, right? Let's find the 1% we agree on and start from there.
Yeah, you could talk about it that way. I mean, when I do the difficult conversations piece, I'm spending a lot of time thinking about not only what I'm saying, but wrestling with how am I being heard?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
So when I'm talking to someone, here's my example. When I'm talking to someone who does not have theological categories, they're religiously and theologically disconnected and don't have a theological belief, and I say to them, God says or the Bible says, what have I said to them? What are they hearing? And the answer is, I have a little ditty that goes with it. NOTHING. That's what that means to me. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. 2, 3, 4. Okay.
Yeah.
I haven't said anything to them. Okay. Anything that they value.
Right.
Okay. So how do you correct that? Well, you have to correct it by correct understanding of the Bible. Okay. Something is not true because it's in the Bible, although that's true. Okay. But it's in the Bible because it's true on its own merits. It was true before God said it and put it in the Bible. So we ought to treat it that way. We ought to talk about it that way. The Bible is a disclosure about the way things are, okay? But the Bible doesn't make it true. It was true before it ever went in the Bible. That's why God put it in the Bible. And if we will think and talk about it that way, we actually have a chance of having a conversation with someone without them having to imbibe in a total worldview first in order to be able to process what it is I'm saying to them.
Yeah, so I think you're saying biblicism, it can be a very dangerous approach, even if it's true and accurate, because it doesn't necessarily honor the listener.
Exactly correct. That's exactly what I'm saying. And I'm saying, if we will communicate, I mean, for me, I think the gospel to a lot of people is a foreign language.
Right.
Okay. So, I mean, when I say Jesus is the Son of God, let me just take the most basic one. Jesus is the Son of God. Okay. And say, so contemplate this question for a second, because I think when we're sharing Christ, we're actually creating categories people don't have. Okay. So when I say Jesus is the Son of God, ask the question this way: how many human beings other than Jesus have claimed to be the Creator God incarnate out of all the billions of people who've ever existed? Okay. The answer to that question is pretty simple. Okay. The answer is zip, none.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So the category that Jesus is in is a unicorn category. Okay. It's him and him alone. It's a category that otherwise doesn't exist. So no wonder if someone's coming from a theologically, no theological connection or a theologically unexposed tradition where they don't have a lot of exposure, they don't understand where Jesus is. They'll put Jesus in a category, in a religious category, but it won't be the one you're talking about. And so how do you get there? That's the question of modern evangelism and modern mission when you're sharing the gospel.
So I'm assuming part of it is just really careful listening, not to just somebody's words, but to their heart, has got to be central. But also taking the time to try to understand the paradigms in which they're currently functioning.
And the other reality is that as we become more postmodern, people don't understand who they are, and they're searching for location. And what has ended up happening is the location that they search for is a location they create for themselves, because that's the next alternative. If theology isn't right, then the only way to make sense out of life is to define who you are and make sense out of your own life. And that's what people do.
And it ends in disaster.
Mm-hmm.
100% of the time. Let's. My last question is reverting backwards a little bit, but that's okay. I want to go back to the kingdom because the context for this conversation had to do with the last season, which was all about the kingdom of God, and we explored it for like 35 episodes. Michael Vlack, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, Vlack, wrote a book called The New Creation Model from a dispensational standpoint, and he presents an interesting case. He resonates with New Heaven, New Earth, that this all wraps up with the cosmic renewal of everything.
Mm-hmm.
But he says from a dispensational standpoint, we see it split into basically two stages. So the church age right now, we see Christ redeeming individuals and communities. But in terms of creation and culture, it doesn't happen until, I guess, the millennium and the way that he presents it. So I'd just love to hear your comment on that. I struggle with this concept, honestly, because I'm trying to figure, it makes it feel like the cross and the resurrection aren't sufficient, that the church is basically going to be impotent to influence culture. Jesus sort of has to come back and do it himself. That's sort of the vibe. And yet, I mean, I understand the theology from a dispensational standpoint, but do you agree with the split kingdom concept? And if so, help me reconcile that.
Our function is to be a sneak preview of what's coming.
Okay.
Our function is not whether that works or not in the world. Our function is to be faithful to that vision and to reflect that vision. If the culture is drawn in part or in whole towards that vision, that's great. If it isn't, that's okay too. I do believe that in the end, the only way it gets totally fixed is when God fixes it through Christ. I think that's just reality, theological reality. Okay, that's how deep depravity is, if I can say it that way. But my goal is to represent what God is after in every sphere. And so I don't want to split it up that way. I don't want to suggest that what I do in public space is a waste of time.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? And the reason I want to do that, this is the odd part of this. The reason I want to not do that is because I believe that the witness of what God cares about is important for the sake of the message that I'm bringing, that the kingdom is the place where you're going to fix what needs to be fixed. And if I can't draw people into that vision, okay, by bubbling it up or walling it up, okay, I'm not going to help people on the outside. And the mission, the church has two missions. It is to raise up disciples within the church who mature to become like Christ. And the other is to invite people in so there are more people to do that with. Okay. And then if that reflects as light in a dark society, man, that's what I hope happens. Okay. But I'm not responsible for the results.
Right.
I am only responsible because I tell people, man, I want to stay in my pay grade. And I'm glad to stay in my pay grade, because if I had responsibility for that other thing, I would be a mess. And in fact, I would argue some people, because they take responsibility for that other thing, are a mess.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
So my goal, my focus is to be focused on representing what God is doing in the world well, within our own communities, especially place where these things ought to be seen is especially in the church, and then make that offer to people in the world, not to change the world, but to actually invite people into the place where the change can happen and work. And so I tell people, if you look at Ephesians 6, we are not told to take new ground. We are told to hold the ground that God has given us. That's also an important part of the spiritual battle.
You have such a refreshing and unique perspective on this. Do you find, and to me, it's paradigm shifting, right? What's your experience like when you're coming up against very different entrenched ideas of what the kingdom is and how it's working?
Well, I mean, for me, it's a conversation that requires patience. Because people have their defaults and they default into their default. I understand that. And so I tell myself sometimes a person has to hear 3 or 4 times before they kind of put it together. I've been traveling to Australia and New Zealand every other, it's our summer, their winter, for 14 years. Okay. It's only now, after 14 years and multiple visits, that the people with whom I've been talking get this to the point where they say, all right, so how do we structurally implement the things that you're talking about and the emphases that you're talking about? Okay. It took them hearing it a few times because you click back into your defaults.
Right.
Okay. And I appreciate those dynamics. I understand them. I'm subject to them just as much as anybody else is. Okay. Which is why the self-critical piece has to be in there as well. But I think the goal is to try and understand what our assignment is, and to try and stay as focused on that as we can in the best way that we can. And then you leave, the sovereignty of God exists for a reason, and I need to rely on it.
That seems like a perfect comment on which to close. Dr. Bock, I've been delighted by our conversation. Thank you for giving us so much of your time and just absolute blessings on your work. It's been an absolute trip to have you on here today. Thank you.
Well, thank you. You're welcome, Brian.
And there you go. I hope you enjoyed our conversation. Thanks so much for listening, or for watching, or for reading. I'm just glad you're with us. If you want more information on Soil and Roots, you can always find us at soilandroots.org. We're in various social media platforms. If you're on Facebook or Instagram, you can find us at Soil and Roots Podcast, Soil and Roots Podcast. If you're on YouTube or Substack, you can find us at just Soil and Roots. We are a tax-deductible Christian ministry, and we thrive because of your generous giving. So if you'd like to donate to our work of cultivating deep discipleship, you can do that safely and securely by giving online at soilandroots.org. The podcast is produced in-house at Soil and Roots here at Fish Tank Studios, primarily by Zach Fisher, who also provides the music. If you like lo-fi, you can check him out at FishU on Spotify. Thanks so much, and we'll see you next time.